Welcome to another episode of Inside American Politics by Skoob. I'm your host Bradley Teller, and today we're diving deep into one of the most controversial and far-reaching intelligence operations in American history, Operation Chaos. This isn't just another spy story. This is the tale of how two presidents' paranoid dreams led to the systematic surveillance of American citizens, and how the very people tasked with carrying out these orders began to question whether they'd crossed a line that should never be crossed. Imagine for a moment that you're a young American in the late 1960s. You're protesting the Vietnam War, maybe you're part of a student organization, or perhaps you're simply exercising your constitutional right to dissent. What you don't know is that somewhere in a windowless basement at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, your name is being typed into a file. Your activities are being monitored. Your associations are being cataloged. And all of this is happening not because you're a foreign spy or a terrorist, but because two presidents had a dream, a nightmare really, that Soviet money was fueling American dissent. Let's start at the beginning, in 1967, when President Lyndon Johnson was consumed by a question that would define one of the most controversial intelligence operations in American history. As protests against the Vietnam War grew larger and more vocal, Johnson became convinced that this couldn't be organic American dissent. There had to be foreign money behind it. There had to be Soviet manipulation. There had to be KGB puppeteers pulling the strings of American youth. This wasn't just presidential curiosity. This was presidential obsession. And when a president becomes obsessed, the intelligence community responds. The directive that came down was deceptively simple. Determine whether the anti-Vietnam War movement enjoyed any foreign financing or manipulation. But as we'll see, what started as a straightforward intelligence question would morph into something far more sinister and far-reaching. The operation that emerged from this directive would be codenamed Chaos, technically MH Chaos, and it would be housed within James Angleton's counterintelligence staff. Now, if you know anything about James Angleton, you know he was already the most paranoid man in an agency built on paranoia. Angleton was the legendary spy hunter who saw Soviet plots everywhere, who believed that deception was the fundamental principle of intelligence work. In many ways, he was the perfect person to oversee an operation born from presidential paranoia. But here's where the story gets interesting, and where the moral complexity begins to emerge. From the very beginning, Operation Chaos was operating in what intelligence officials called the gray area of the CIA's charter. The National Security Act of 1947, which created the CIA, was very clear about one thing. The agency was forbidden from having police, subpoena, or law enforcement powers or internal security functions. In other words, the CIA was supposed to spy on foreigners, not Americans. Yet here was an operation that would inevitably involve compiling files on American citizens who lived and worked in the United States. The justification was thin but legally plausible. They were investigating potential foreign manipulation of domestic groups. But as we'll see, that justification would stretch thinner and thinner as the operation expanded. To understand how Operation Chaos worked, we need to meet the man who would run it day to day, Richard Ober, a taciturn Harvard graduate who would become the face of domestic surveillance within the CIA. Ober wasn't a wild-eyed extremist or a power-hungry bureaucrat. By all accounts, he was a competent, methodical intelligence officer who found himself tasked with turning presidential paranoia into operational reality. Ober had already demonstrated his willingness to push legal boundaries in an operation against Ramparts magazine. The agency wanted to squish Ramparts because its investigative reporters had been uncovering Langley's most sensitive secrets, including the revelation that the CIA had been funding the National Student Association since 1952. In trying to stop this story, Ober's team investigated the personal and financial affairs of the magazine's staff and backers, all U.S. citizens. They put them under surveillance. They gathered material for potential blackmail. Years later, Edgar Applewhite, a member of Ober's staff, would give a chilling interview about these activities. "We had awful things in mind," he said, "some of which we carried out." When concerns were raised about the legality of these tactics, the deputy director for plans dismissed them with dark humor. "Oh, Eddie, you have a spot of blood on your pinafore." This was the mindset and methodology that would be scaled up for Operation Chaos. The operation began modestly, housed in 3 second-floor rooms close to Angleton's office in an area called the Black Section. But as it grew, it would require more secure accommodation, eventually migrating to the most secure space Langley could provide, a suite of windowless rooms behind a cipher-locked steel door in the basement, informally known as the Vault. Let me introduce you to Frank Rafalco, a man who never asked to be part of Operation Chaos. Frank had joined the CIA hoping to get into the career training program. He wanted to be out in the field, acquiring intelligence from real assets. But the agency decided that a master's degree should be required for that work, and Frank didn't have one. So instead of chasing spies in exotic locations, Frank found himself in a basement, chasing American college students and anti-war protesters. Frank's story gives us a ground-level view of how chaos actually operated. The Vault, as he described it, was laid out like a small city of surveillance. There was Richard Ober's office, serving as the command center. There was the New Left section and the Black Power section, because even in their surveillance, they organized American dissent into neat, bureaucratic categories. There was a coffee area with a large table next to the Xerox machine, where agents would process the endless stream of surveillance reports. And there were desks occupied by staff who processed material supplied by the National Security Agency, that secretive organization that monitored communications all over the world. Yes, you heard that right. The NSA, America's Signals Intelligence Agency, was providing communications intercepts to Operation Chaos. This meant that the most sophisticated surveillance apparatus in the world was being turned inward, monitoring not foreign enemies but American citizens. Phone calls were monitored, telegrams were intercepted. The technological might of the American intelligence community was being deployed against American college students, civil rights activists, and anti-war protesters. James Angleton himself was a mysterious presence in all of this. According to Frank, Angleton took little direct interest in the day-to-day operations of Chaos. He had a habit of arriving when the team was at lunch and working late into the night in his shuttered office, the gleam of his little desk lamp faintly visible through the blinds. He was a very mysterious person, Frank recalled, which is saying something in an agency built on mystery. As Operation Chaos expanded throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s, its agents were engaged in an increasingly desperate search for something that, as it turned out, didn't exist. They were looking for Moscow gold, evidence of Soviet funding and manipulation of American dissent. They had sophisticated computer systems churning through data on thousands of Americans. They had agents infiltrating protest groups, sometimes even traveling abroad to join foreign anti-war organizations to maintain their cover. But here's the thing about chasing phantoms. No matter how much energy you expend, no matter how sophisticated your methods, you can't find something that isn't there. The computer system called Hydra processed data on 9,994 names, but it couldn't detect a ruble of Moscow gold. American radicals, it seemed, were financing their own dissent, motivated by their own convictions about Vietnam, civil rights, and social justice. By 1971, the operation had expanded far beyond its original mandate. CIA agents were operating inside America, infiltrating protest groups not to investigate foreign manipulation, but simply to gather intelligence on domestic dissent. The legal justification, investigating potential foreign influence, had become a fig leaf covering wholesale domestic surveillance. Even within the CIA, people were beginning to notice and worry. The younger officers who knew about CHAOS repeatedly expressed concern that the CIA was acting outside its charter, that American domestic dissent was not the CIA's province. These weren't bleeding heart liberals or anti-war protesters. These were CIA officers, people who had dedicated their careers to American intelligence work, and they were troubled by what they were being asked to do. When Richard Nixon succeeded Lyndon Johnson in 1969, you might have expected Operation Chaos to wind down. After all, it was Johnson's paranoid dream that had created the operation in the first place. But Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, had their own paranoid dreams, their own obsessions with domestic dissent and media leaks. The operation not only continued under Nixon, it expanded. Nixon and Kissinger were particularly furious about leaks to journalists, especially columnist Jack Anderson, who had published stories obviously based on classified material dealing with foreign policy issues. They used that same gray area in the CIA charter, the director's responsibility for protecting intelligence sources and methods from unauthorized disclosure, to justify having the CIA conduct surveillance on Anderson. About 50 people were involved in this surveillance operation. William Colby, who would later become CIA director, saw the writing on the wall early. When he learned about the Anderson surveillance, he told Howard Osborne, "Let's face it then, there's not one chance in a million that this is going to stay a secret. Sooner or later, this is going to make the headlines." He was right. It did make headlines in 1975, when the full scope of CIA domestic operations was finally exposed. Meanwhile, Operation Chaos itself was evolving. By 1972, even Richard Helms, the CIA director, realized that the original justification for chaos was wearing thin. He instructed that the operation be transformed from an investigation of the anti-war movement into an investigation of international terrorism, an area that was well within the agency's legal operating guidelines. This was a face-saving move, an attempt to put chaos on firmer legal ground, but the damage was already done. Despite this official change in mission, an associated operation called Project Resistance, conducted by the Office of Security, continued surveillance of American domestic dissent until it was finally terminated in June 1973. The machinery of domestic surveillance, once created, had developed its own momentum. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Operation Chaos story is how it reveals the conscience of the American intelligence community. These weren't jackbooted thugs or authoritarian true believers. These were professional intelligence officers who increasingly found themselves troubled by what they were being asked to do. William Brough, who served as CIA Inspector General, captured this internal unease in a remarkable report from the autumn of 1972. He wrote, "Even though there is a general belief that CIA involvement is directed primarily at foreign manipulation and subversive exploitation of U.S. citizens, we also encountered general concern over what appeared to constitute a monitoring of the political views and activities of Americans not known to be or suspected of being involved in espionage." Think about what Brough was saying here. Even the people conducting the surveillance were uncomfortable with it. They understood that they were supposed to be looking for foreign manipulation, but what they were actually doing was monitoring the political views and activities of ordinary Americans. Sometimes, stations were asked to report on the whereabouts and activities of prominent people, whose comings and goings were not only in the public domain, but for whom allegations of subversion seemed sufficiently nebulous to raise renewed doubts as to the nature and legitimacy of the MH-Chaos program. This internal resistance wasn't limited to the operational level. The Vietnam War was tearing apart American society, and the CIA wasn't immune to these divisions. Protests against the war echoed inside the agency itself, forcing Abbott Smith and then John Huizenga, consecutive heads of the Office of National Estimates, to lecture their analysts on the need for impartiality and professional detachment. They made it clear that passion that might cloud judgment would not be tolerated, regardless of what analysts felt about the war personally. Perhaps the most insightful analysis of what went wrong with Operation Chaos came from Harry Rositzky, the crossword-loving Anglo-Saxon scholar who had been attached to the operation in its earliest days. Rositzky was one of the first to recognize that the operation was based on a false premise, that American dissent required foreign funding and manipulation to exist. Rositzky left the CIA in 1970 to raise crossbred Angus calves on a farm near Middleburg, Virginia, but he maintained a parallel career as a commentator on agency affairs. In the early 1970s, as various intelligence scandals began breaking into public view, American intelligence personnel felt very much in need of sympathetic commentary. In 1977, Rositzky published The CIA's Secret Operations, which was partly an attempt to defend the agency, but also contained a devastating diagnosis of the institutional problems that had led to operations like Chaos. They form a society of their own, he wrote, with purposes and standards distinct from those of the nation. Prolonged immersion in the segregated, self-contained, and self-justifying world of deception and secrecy tends to erode links to reality. This is a profound observation. Rositsky was arguing that the misuse and abuse of the CIA may have been as much the result of the inner momentum of an isolated and hallucinatory bureaucracy as of the interference of presidents. In other words, it wasn't just that Johnson and Nixon had paranoid dreams. It was that the CIA had become the kind of institution that would turn those dreams into operational reality without sufficient critical examination. Rositsky might have been describing the workings of a cult, and in many ways, that's exactly what the intelligence community had become during this period. A closed world with its own logic, its own justifications, and its own momentum, increasingly disconnected from the democratic values it was supposed to serve. By the early 1970s, rumors about Operation Chaos were circulating widely within the CIA itself, and these rumors were making people very uncomfortable. Few people knew the operation's actual name or its full scope, but there was a growing sense that Richard Ober and his team were doing something illegal in the basement. In December 1971, Thomas Karamessines, the CIA's deputy director of plans, felt obliged to address these concerns directly. He assembled his junior staff to listen to their worries about the agency's activities. The group, he noted afterward, mentioned Dick Ober's unit and said that there was a lot of scuttlebutt that the purpose of this unit was to keep book on Black Power adherents. Karamessines tried to reassure his staff, telling them not to worry about the rumors and not to believe anything they read in Ramparts magazine, that same publication that had earlier exposed CIA funding of the National Student Association. But his reassurances fell flat. He failed to put their minds at rest because the rumors were essentially true. This internal unease is crucial to understanding the chaos story. This wasn't a case of a rogue operation hidden from agency leadership. Senior officials knew what was happening and were trying to manage both the operation and the growing concerns about it. But they were caught in an impossible position. How do you justify an operation that everyone knows is legally questionable, morally problematic, and ultimately ineffective? The beginning of the end for Operation Chaos came in December 1974, when investigative reporter Seymour Hersh, the same reporter who had broken the My Lai massacre story, began hearing whispers about what would become known as Langley's biggest secret. Hersh's sources couldn't put a name to the operation, but they told him about wiretaps and burglaries, infiltrators, and data banks. They described a well-funded, high-tech, and illegal surveillance operation against American citizens both at home and abroad. They even told him who was running the show. When Hersh called Richard Ober's home in Fairfax, Virginia, Ober's response was characteristically terse. "There's nothing I can say about this." It was, perhaps, the most honest and expansive public statement that Ober ever made about his work. But by the time Hersh was making his calls, it was already too late to write a comprehensive history of Operation Chaos. The CIA had begun shutting it down, Richard Ober had been quietly transferred to the National Security Council, and the process of destroying the Chaos files had already begun. Frank Rafalco, our guide to life in the vault, was there when it happened. "People say they never cut out the Chaos program, but they did," he explained. "It was cut out even before Colby. He shut it down officially, but it was already shut down before that. There were very few people left." The destruction of the Operation Chaos files was so extensive that it gained its own unofficial code name, Operation Destruction. An officer named White was assigned to oversee the process, and it was a massive undertaking. The destruction was systematic and thorough. Computer tapes were unspooled and fed to incinerators. Shredded letters, telegrams, and newspaper clippings were burned. Years of surveillance data on American citizens literally went up in smoke. Frank Rafalco was involved in this process and was keen to point out that the destruction was conducted in accordance with the law. Congress had instructed that such records not be retained. But as Frank noted, obliterating the records had an unintended consequence. It created a space in which fantasies about the power and the reach of the Central Intelligence Agency could thrive. It opened up another space in which to dream. This is one of the great ironies of the chaos story. An operation that began with presidential fantasies about Soviet manipulation ended by creating new fantasies about CIA power and reach. The destruction of the files meant that the full truth about chaos would never be known, leaving room for speculation, exaggeration, and conspiracy theories. On December 22, 1974, Seymour Hersh's story ran in the New York Times with a headline that would shake the intelligence community to its core. Huge CIA. Operation reported in U.S. against anti-war forces, other dissidents in Nixon years. The story was accompanied by photographs of the three most recent CIA directors, Richard Helms, James Schlesinger, and William Colby. Hersh's unnamed source, described as a former CIA officer, revealed the same suspicions that had been circulating within the agency for years. Ober had unique and confidential access to Helms. I always assumed he was mucking about with Americans who were abroad and then would come back, people like the Black Panthers. The public reaction was swift and intense. This wasn't just another intelligence scandal. This was confirmation of many Americans' worst fears about their own government. The CIA, the agency that was supposed to protect America from foreign threats, had been systematically spying on American citizens exercising their constitutional rights. The exposure triggered a series of investigations that would reshape American intelligence oversight for decades to come. President Gerald Ford quickly appointed his vice president, Nelson Rockefeller, to head a new inquiry into intelligence services. The Rockefeller Commission's report would reveal the operational name of chaos and describe its scale and scope to the American public for the first time. The consequences of the Operation Chaos exposure were profound and long-lasting. The scandal became a national symbol of unchecked governmental power and the dangers inherent when intelligence agencies target their own citizens. The revelations showed that the CIA had amassed files on over 7,000 Americans and indexed at least 300,000 names and groups, all without proper legal authority or oversight. The political fallout was immediate and severe. The Rockefeller Commission was seen by many as insufficient, failing to fully grapple with the scale and implications of chaos. This led to the establishment of the Church Committee in 1975, a landmark Senate investigation that would publicly document illegal intelligence activities directed at American citizens for the first time. But perhaps the most important legacy of Operation Chaos was the impetus it gave to intelligence oversight reform. The scandal highlighted the urgent need for strict controls and accountability over intelligence agencies. Congressional oversight mechanisms were significantly strengthened. Permanent intelligence committees were established in both the House and Senate. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978 was passed to restrict intelligence agency activities on U.S. soil, creating the FISA courts that still oversee domestic surveillance today. The cultural impact was equally significant. Public trust in the CIA and government institutions suffered a blow from which they have never fully recovered. The chaos revelations became a cautionary tale cited in debates over intelligence conduct for decades to come, from the surveillance activities following 9/11 to more recent disclosures about bulk data collection on U.S. citizens. As we close this deep dive into Operation Chaos, one question lingers. How close did a democracy come to turning its surveillance inward, and how easily did it happen? What began as presidential paranoia quietly evolved into a domestic spying machine that crossed constitutional lines and watched thousands of ordinary Americans. The most unsettling part isn't that fear existed at the top, but how seamlessly that fear became policy, how long it took for anyone to push back, and how fragile accountability proved to be. Yet within the shadows, there were voices of resistance, analysts, inspectors, and insiders who recognized the danger and spoke up. The exposure of Operation Chaos forced reforms, oversight, and legal limits. But were they enough? And could something like this happen again, under a different name? If you want to explore the unanswered questions, the hidden documents, and the full story behind one of America's most secretive intelligence programs, don't stop here. Download the Skoob App now to get access to the complete episode and uncover what history tried to bury.